Спасибо большое еще раз.
Thank you very much, Shum. Been here longer than we were prepared for. We have our next guest speaker. This is the most crowded afternoon we've had in a while. I can briefly say for generations of my family, as my grandfather was a combat medic himself against the hostile armies of World War II for the Americans, I am thrilled to be able to, I'm here able to support a Ukrainian combat medic fighting for his country on the front lines. We find it very inspiring. Our next guest, if you don't mind, thank you. You're welcome back anytime, sir. If you give us some heads up, we'll be happy to find someone here who can translate for you. And I think we've all truly appreciated it. I've gotten a number of PMs stating how much you are truly loved, and what you've had to bring to us has been great.
И спасибо большое, Шум, что вы сегодня к нам присоединились. Вы держались с нами даже дольше, чем мы на это рассчитывали, зная, какое драгоценное для вас время. Поэтому мы все очень-очень благодарны. Ждем вас, когда у вас будет возможность. Просто так напишите нам чуть-чуть заблаговременно, что вам у вас есть время забежать, и мы найдем вам переводчика, то есть меня, например. И сейчас у нас уже время для нового гостя, но Finance рассказывает, что никогда бы не мог подумать, что когда-то, знаю, что у него сам дед был боевым медиком, он будет помогать освещать информацию от парамедика о событиях вот такого характера. Поэтому спасибо вам большое, что сегодня к нам присоединились. Для нас это реально очень честь. І для мене особисто це нереально просто вдячність за те, що все ви робите. Правда, очень-очень благодарна за всю вашу работу. Большой привет и спасибо бригаде. Вот мы не с вами физически, но мы всегда с вами, за всех.
Да, спасибо вам большое, спасибо и вам за то, что вы освещаете наши проблемы, что вы не безразличны к той беде, которая у нас происходит, вот, за то, что вы понимаете, что эта беда может распространиться и на другие страны, и на другие континенты. Спасибо за помощь, которую вы оказываете, поскольку я думаю, что и наша пресса освещает, и вы видите, что действительно та помощь, которая исходит и от западных всех партнеров, в частности от Соединенных Штатов Америки, она не проходит незамеченной. Это очень придает нам сил и уверенности в нашей борьбе, и это очень бьет по врагу, что, безусловно, не может нас не радовать. Спасибо вам огромное. Все буде Україна.
Все буде Україна. Бережіть себе, будь ласка. Thank you so very much, guys, for raising awareness and making sure that all the problems that we face are being addressed. Thanks for caring about it. Thanks for your attitude, because you realize that this kind of horrifying events might just spread all over the world. So thanks for every help that you've been provided. I know that the media has been covering how much of the assistance and help has been coming from the partners, and you have to understand that nothing comes unnoticed. We see how much the West and the US and the miracle world has been providing for us. It gives us more strength and confidence, and it just hits the enemy so hard you can't even imagine. So everything will be Ukraine eventually, meaning everything will be good. So thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Shane. I would like to take the moment to announce our next guest. We have a very packed afternoon. Mr. Lucas Timicki of LRT Capital. He's a hedge fund manager who was also Polish born. I would love for him to give a little more of his own bio, because he understands the region quite well. I remember I once had the pleasure of seeing inside his apartment, and on his walls he keeps 4 pictures of the gentlemen and I believe there's of the people, I should say, who helped bring down the last iteration of the horrific Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. So definitely this is a conflict that he understands quite well. So without further ado, welcome to the space, Lucas.
Thank you, Finance. Thank you all. I hope you're all positive after the previous speaker, and I think that's very brave work that people are doing on the front lines. Unfortunately, what I'm about to tell you may be more depressing, so that's why I'm hoping you're starting from a good high point of spirits. As Finance mentioned, I'm originally from Warsaw, Poland. I grew up in the UK, Hungary, years in the United States, and as he mentioned further, I do manage an investment fund based in Austin, Texas. What I can speak to is what I see from the Western perspective, and how I think the conflict may, the war. We can say war in this space. We don't have to.
Yeah, we're having issues with your audio, Lucas.
Oh, we are. Okay.
Yeah, your audio is coming in and out. Yes, we are very clear here that it's a war. This is not a conflict. We aren't sugarcoating anything. There's a genocide going on. We aren't pretending here.
Great. No, I'm on vacation in Punta Cana, so whatever you may not be hearing is unfortunately due to the wonderful cell reception here. It's the best I can do. I'll keep my remarks brief, I guess.
You're coming through great now. I'll just let you know when you break up. It's fine. We're used to it.
Perfect. Thank you. I do think the most important thing to me when I think about the situation in Ukraine is that the Western response has been reactive, has been semi-passive, has been always trying to, not upset Putin in any way, or minimize kind of upsetting him, and kind of too little. I think that's prolonged conflict, unfortunately. And so that to me is the key fact, and unfortunately, especially in the U.S., we're moving towards the midterm elections, and the issue of Ukraine is it's not even a top 5 issue for most voters. I would add that I worked in political consulting for a while. So, I don't think there's going to be any dramatic breakthrough, unfortunately, in the situation. We just heard Lavrov say today they want to take more territory. So now, the Russian position, if you will, has evolved. It's no longer about denazification or the Donbass. It's just kind of a bigger land grab. And I think the U.S. and the EU will provide some support from the humanitarian and military side, but just enough for the Ukrainians not to lose, probably, and probably none for them to really win. And as a result, we're heading towards, I think, a prolonged war. And to me, the economic consequences of that are a much weaker Europe, which is much more dependent on, energy supplies from Russia, and a relatively stronger U.S., which is really isolated from, what's happening in Europe. It's energy secure and it's kind of far away. So it's relatively in a better position. And I think the last thing I'd add is, there is going to probably be a fracturing of the political consensus in Europe as energy scarcity, energy prices really affect industry in Germany and other places, and countries like Hungary. Viktor Orban has buddied up to Putin, and he's happy and he has gas supplies assured. So unfortunately, I think the longer this lasts, the weaker Europe gets and the more fractured it gets. And Ukraine probably continues to bleed, unfortunately, for a prolonged period. So, I think I'll stop here and see if you have any questions.
Yeah, we actually have regular military updates from both local. We have our own military experts who are regulars on the space, but also people you might know like John Spencer, Chuck Farrer, and on some occasions Alexander Binman all stop in and discuss the military situation. There's definitely a current logistical almost collapse going on with the Russian lines with the introduction of HIMARS into the Ukrainian military. So I actually personally kind of agree with you on how energy is fracturing the European consensus. But I would push back and say, what does your outlook look like with the same European political analysis but a situation where Ukraine actually does, if given, because they are being given the kind of artillery that can just stop Russia to allow a win. What happens if Ukraine wins and that other kind of fracturing occurs in Europe? What does that look like to you? How does that change your outlook?
Sure what a Ukrainian win looks like at this point. You know, if you mean by taking back all the territory that it previously had, you know, pre-February, or are we talking
I'm
about...
saying pre-2014, Donbass, Luhansk, and Crimea.
I will eat my hat if that happens.
Can we film that then?
Sorry, if that happens, then I think that's wonderful. And everyone rushes towards celebration and peace. And I suspect, regrettably, but I suspect Russia will be welcomed with open arms back to the world, probably much sooner than it deserves to, because of, you know, its vast energy resources and the desire of the West to continue exploiting them.
Axel, I think you might have a good comment here.
Well, one or two. First and foremost, Lukasz, dzień dobry. Good to meet you. Thank you very much for joining us today. I think you pointed the finger directly at the wound, the fracturing in Europe, whenever there's a possibility, and shall we say, whenever there's a possibility to be on the wrong side of history, the Europeans, specifically the Germans, are very good at it. But in this instance, obviously, the political landscape in Europe has not yet shifted to the point that they do understand that Americans, Brits, Australians, Kiwis, and Canadians have saved them already twice. And this time around, the Europeans have to do their bidding together with them. That probably has not quite happened. In that regard, I tend to agree that there is a sincere risk. But let me disabuse you of the notion that Ukraine has no chance of taking the territory back, and I will welcome you to select the hat you're going to be eating, whilst Finance and I will film it, and we'll have a beer afterwards to gulp it down. Because if you had the opportunity to listen a few weeks ago when General McRyan, former Major General of the Australians, who's been embedded with NATO, as well as the DoD for many years, and has been touring a few countries where the Americans and others have lost a lot of blood and treasure in recent 20 years. As Mick Ryan analyzed it rather clearly, is that the Russians cannot sustain that war. And whilst the bleeding is on the Ukrainian side, the logistical challenge, which another good general who's been not only a friend of the program, but been with us on a regular basis, Ben Hodges, former 7th Army, US Army Europe commander, who called out Putin's war, together with Philip Breedlove, between 2014 and 2016 publicly, and explained how Putin would do it, by the way, which is exactly what happened. They all have so far agreed on one thing, is that the introduction of well-suited weapon systems will change the calculus. And Ukraine has shown that it can actually execute and prosecute that. So I put it to you, Ukraine will take out the logistical functions of the Russian army, and we will see not only their culmination, which has already begun at various parts of the front face, but there will be deep strikes committed, because the Ramstein 4 meeting and the discussions which have been had today in Washington will lead to the release of LIVECAMS. It will lead to the release of Bradleys and other infantry fighting vehicles, which the Ukrainians militarily will need. So in that regard, I can provide you a bit more comfort that, contrary to what often is perceived as a very, very difficult, and it is difficult, but a very difficult, if not insurmountable, Russian offensive capacity, we are the West. We're supplying them, and we're supplying them with a lot more than most people can see, because they see above the radar. With that being said, imagine what I said is true. And imagine that Ukraine will now prosecute. What would you expect? How would Russia, knowing that it's losing, react? Well, I think, you know, it would be wonderful if
things do turn out that way, Axel, and you know, I'm certainly cheering on the Ukrainian side. You know, how would they react? I think the rational actor would probably look to find some peace, and some negotiated settlement. But so I'm afraid that's probably what we see, and I guess some kind of ceasefire agreement, probably relating to, you know, the upcoming winter, is what I would expect. And frankly, I would expect that anyway, because fighting in the winter is going to be much more difficult for both sides. And from the Russian side, if I was Russia, some kind of military operation.
Lucas, you're breaking up again, sir.
Sorry. I would simply say, you know, I would be looking to some kind of ceasefire or the end of the military operation this winter. Let the Europeans starve themselves and freeze themselves with their, you know, lower and lower supplies of natural gas, and probably, you know, another offensive next spring. That's my best guess. That's my guess. Prolong.
Thank you. While we're here, Madi, do you have something on the energy side of this to ask, or another related question?
I think Tom's first, but I do have an energy question.
Tom.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm often wondering how long this war might continue for. And you said that, you know, as it continues, you're perceiving or predicting that the Western consensus could break down, particularly because of the energy, which Maddie's going to be asking about. I mean, over what period of time do you think the Western consensus will break down? Do you think it could be like this winter, or do you think it would take longer than that, or do you think it's breaking down already? Like, what period of time do you think the West can sustain the level of support that it is providing at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, my guess is that, you know, probably there will be, in some countries, there will need to be rationing of gas this winter, unless there's some big change and more gas, you know, suddenly becomes available. And that means that probably by next spring, when you get into the season where normally you're building gas stocks, and unless you have a lot of supply and you're building up gas stocks for the next winter, you know, then I think that's where you probably hit the panic button. There's other options, you know, more supplies from the US. There's sort of other things that could happen. There's changes Germany can make with respect to nuclear policy and shutting down reactors. But my best guess, you know, we're probably 18 months away from a real kind of hard break. You know, the forward energy markets for, like, for example, in Europe, is between 5,000 to 6,000 euros per capita next year. And now Germany, I believe, per capita income is 33,000 euros. So, you know, I don't know how that's possible. Volkswagen seems to be heading for nationalization, frankly, because they can't continue operating in those. I mean, you can imagine all sorts of crazy scenarios, and markets always have this way of jumping to conclusions. So what I'm saying may sound a bit hysterical, but that's kind of the market always thinks forward. So I'm giving you sort of the bleakest scenario. I think, yeah, next year.
Before Madi goes, could you give us a little more data on the numbers you've run as far as what, at the current rate you're looking at, European energy prices look like this winter? And even, is there even supply at certain prices?
So the numbers I've seen, you know, suggest that Germany may draw supply natural gas storage, which normally doesn't happen in the summer. Normally you go into the winter with peak supply, and you draw those stocks down through the winter. right? There were reports a couple of days ago about the largest, one of the largest utilities in Germany needing to price the spot price high. They were, potentially heading for bankruptcy and potentially needing to be nationalized by the federal government of Germany. There are reports again suggesting between 5,000 to 6,000 euros of additional cost in Germany. In Poland, gas prices and electricity prices have more than doubled year over year, and people are being told to expect another doubling this winter. Poland, but it's finishing. It's going to be commissioning a new pipeline, which is going to deliver natural gas from Norway. So, Poland is in a better position than many other countries. So, I think that's going to continue to be a difficult challenge, and especially if you look at it 12 months into the future, a lot of German industry will not be able to operate if you really believe that the future forward price for energy
We've been discussing this topic here in extensio on the space already in March in regard to the necessary changes the German government would have to take, but it ideologically was unwilling to do so. Now, you just highlighted rumors of nationalization, which are spreading predominantly in the English language press, but they have absolutely no foundation in fact, because the holding, especially for Volkswagen, the holding, 31.4% is Porsche, if I'm not quite mistaken, still the family. You have about 11% for the state of Lower Saxony, which wields a massive influence already. And then there's 10.5 or something for Qatar. I tend to believe that these three definitely have more than enough money to carry Volkswagen through. The question is whether the emergency loan facilities will be open for Volkswagen, which definitely the state of Lower Saxony will do, which is not a nationalization, but it's a loan program. And as to the other point, one thing is absolutely clear. The energy prices are hitting the chemical industry as well as the manufacturing industry of Germany excessively hard. And that is where the current government is actually pushing Germany over the brink. But at the same time, they know that Germany can, to a certain satisfaction point, still pay higher energy prices, whereas the rest of Europe cannot. We had Dr. Benjamin Schmidt here, a reasonably decent expert in this matter and former member of the National Security Council in the US, and Mark Nelson, an expert in energy production and nuclear energy and a nuclear scientist, who all, just like we, agree on this point that Germany needs to turn the ship around, but they won't, and they won't do it politically unless there's pressure. Now, you are in the US, obviously not on holiday, but still, you are in the US. How do you see, in view of the midterms, the possibility of reinvigorated pressure on Germany in terms of economic policy? Because the current administration does not exert much pressure on Germany.
Axel, so first of all, I'm in no way, blaming the German government. Just to be very clear about that, and I think they're doing the best they can.
I do.
In
I do.
incredibly difficult. Look, I think they're doing the best they can in an incredibly difficult situation, and they have internal politics to deal with as well. As for Germany in the context of the political landscape in the US, of either side in the last several months, and the average American voter can't locate Germany on the map. So when you're talking about the U.S. exerting pressure on Germany, I've never heard of the issue to begin with.
Well, the Senate Armed Forces Committee and the House have passed resolutions in that regard already, and I do know our friends in the administration, respectively those in the DoD being our friends, because those we know, they feel that this is an issue which is highly debated in the Senate and the House. But obviously you're right, relatively little, if any, of such discussion is taken out in public. I was more referring to the politicians, because if you're in finance, you have your hand on the pulse of the market, and therefore what the political framers are doing, if they're doing something.
As I think the main, and the government is, the government with the president as it is, I think the president has a hard time sometimes knowing where he is when he wakes up in the morning. So frankly, there's very little confidence on him leading any policy on the matter. The reality is that likely to take fall, which will make any domestic agenda in the U.S. gridlocked for next 2 years. So I think that's most likely what's going to happen. I think the U.S. may take in more refugees from Ukraine and will probably continue to send additional aid to Ukraine. $1 billion here, $1 billion there, but see it lead and a willingness to lead on any kind of European security issues from the administration, be it boots on the ground, be it more money, be it other facilities that might aid European allies through the winter. I mean, the U.S. is committed to sending exports of LNG, but U.S. export capacity is already maxed out. The Freeport plant probably will restart in the next 60 days. But again, that's pretty much contracted for the next 2 years.
Thank you for the explanation. Madi, thank you for waiting patiently, sir.
Sure. I actually have two questions now that Lukash brought up LNG. Does the infrastructure in Europe actually support the required LNG transportation in case there's no pipe deliveries from Russia? And how do those numbers of 5 to 6K per capita energy costs change? Because I think those numbers include at least some level of supply coming from Russia. What happens with those numbers? How do forecasts change if there's no supply coming from Russia? And the reason I'm asking this is, of course, I'm speculating, but in case Ukraine does win the war very quickly, and by very quickly, I mean within the next 6 to 12 months, there's a possibility that Russia itself might actually descend into chaos and a civil war might start. So that would completely disrupt the supplies going into Europe.
So, Madi,
Yes.
your question is actually, is it not in the best interest of Europe to actually activate its infrastructure, isn't it? Because
Pretty
no matter
much.
how the war... Okay,
Exactly.
sorry. Lukash.
I'm doing it in a roundabout way.
Yes. So, Europe does have LNG import capacity, right? They have reliquefaction terminals. Germany has talked about building additional terminals. Now, these kind of terminals take 2 to 3 years to build, and Axel will know better the situation. Europe does have capacity to import LNG in significant amounts. I think the bigger point about Russia descending into chaos, is a roundabout way of saying that many European leaders have said this in different ways. That we quote unquote can't humiliate Russia. We don't want to see a collapse. That's all driven by these kind of interests of preserving stability in Russia, preserving some level of supplies. The analysis of 5,000 to 6,000 euros that I've seen for Germany was based on the current market forward prices for electricity in particular, and LNG.
Yeah, and those forward contracts and those prices are correct. Yeah.
I think it's important to understand that Europe, has this emissions trading scheme for carbon dioxide. And the way that works is every government gets a bunch of credits every year, and the number of those credits shrinks every year. And then they're traded amongst utilities to sort of on this, path towards decarbonization, and there seems to be very strong political consensus towards that. But that does raise the cost of electricity, and sort of baseload electricity in Europe still overwhelmingly comes from fossil fuels, which are then having to purchase these credits, which are becoming more scarce and thus more expensive every year. The other point I would make, since we're kind of talking about energy, is Germany has spent a tremendous amount of money over the last 15 plus years building out renewables, and renewables meaning wind and solar energy, which are very powerful when they work, but they are not working all the time, right? The sun is not shining all the time, the wind is not blowing, and there is no cost-effective long-term solution right now. If you look at the statistics, production capacity of energy in Germany has almost doubled over the last 15 years, and yet the price of electricity has also doubled, and emissions have actually gone up, depending on the time period that you look at. And the reason emissions have gone up is that nuclear power plants are being shut down and replaced by coal-fired power plants. I do wonder if Europe will remain on the path towards which I personally view as a crazy path, but Greta Thunberg is still welcomed in places. Instead of being in a lunatic asylum, she's still being invited to speak at political rallies. So there's strong, I think, still consensus within Europe for that path, and that does put pressure.
Mic check.
I think we lost them at a critical point, because the analysis is correct. Europe is artificially shifting its energy policy towards a structural dependency towards the hydrocarbons generated from Russia. And it fails to acknowledge that nuclear, and therefore lower energy cost, could have actually saved itself from that dependency and generated better industrial electricity access. But then again, we've said this here many times before. I think Lukasz will come back on, right? Can you DM him, Vinance?
Yeah, I already messaged him, and he is coming back up.
And they still can, right, Axel?
I'm back. I'm back. Yes, no.
Yeah. Whenever we lose your sound, you don't know when we do, and we'll just push you down. And then you just ask to come back up. We'll pull you back up. That's just how we do it.
Yeah, I heard Axel speak, and I think that's exactly right. For various reasons, nuclear is not very popular in Europe, and even if it became popular tomorrow, it takes a very long time to add nuclear to the mix. It is a think about. So if you want to dive into energy a little deeper, if you think about the cost of solar and the cost of wind, many people will tell you that the costs of solar have really come down dramatically. And that is true, assuming, a certain amount of power is being produced every year. The problem is, as you try more in power, again, solar and wind, you get to a point where you have overproduction in the middle of the day. And you can look at this yourself. Most state utility grid operators actually have websites which show you production from different sources by source and almost in real time. The Polish grid has this. The website is So, and Poland is not by any means a leader in solar production, is producing roughly a quarter of its electricity any given day during the summer from solar. And that means, to balance the grid, the operator is shutting down coal and other thermal hydrocarbon powered plants. What happens, unfortunately, is that many of these plants, you don't really get to shut them down for a number of hours, right? The furnaces are still kind of kept hot, and in many cases, you have to either disconnect solar or you have to disconnect, the fossil fuels from the grid. And so, if you imagine solar, the cost is X, but if you end up disconnecting it from the grid every single day of the summer for a number of hours because you're actually overproducing, the cost becomes higher and higher. And as you integrate more and more solar and wind into the grid, those intermittent sources are much more likely to have to be disconnected during the day. So you're having that situation. Again, in some other power plants, which are carbohydrate, and fossil fuel powered plants, you actually have to continue burning fossil fuels throughout the day, which of course is the worst of all worlds, right? Because you're actually still emitting pollution while not generating any electricity for the grid. So, and you see this in almost any country you look at, as you try to increase the amount of solar and wind, you get into this kind of dead end where they're not able to be used all the time, and then the cost becomes prohibitively high. So that's a policy I think that's going to have to be confronted sooner rather than later.
Yeah, these are very good points, and the initiatives as to the transmission grid improvement necessary for such intermittent sources to be connected, and the distribution systems in turn to be adjusted to that as well, have led to massive infrastructure plans across Europe in recent years, none of which have really been fully completed, despite the fact that grid operators have to also at the same time fight with baseload requirements, which currently only the French can satisfy completely all the time. Now, we have more energy questions, Lukasz, if you don't mind. We'll go to Marty and Ryan, and then afterwards I would like to go back to what I think is dear to your heart and mine and finances, the lead indicators for actions in markets and what they may say about, say, the trajectory of certain parts of the war. Marty.
I just wonder, what are the implications for specifically Germany if Nord Stream 1 function is not renewed? Because there was a piece of news that came out earlier today announcing that the European Commission is setting up a plan in case that doesn't happen.
Well, if, as I said, Germany and Europe in general need natural gas for the winter, and there's a limited supply of it. We're in a part of the year where normally you're importing gas, you're building reserves, you're building stocks for the winter, and different countries are in a different position. Poland is independent more or less from Russia at this point. Hungary, Russia, for Putin, and Putin has assured him of continued supplies. And then Germany is in this position where, again, they may have a shortage of gas and rationing this winter if there's not renewed supplies through Nord Stream 1. And again, if that continues into the spring and you're not building stocks into the next year, then you may have a real following winter. And on this point, especially right now, as we're talking about energy policy and global warming, there's record heat waves in the UK, and you're probably going to hear reports about how many people are going to be killed by the heat wave, and therefore we must do things about global warming. If you look at the statistics in almost any country you look at in Europe, more people die in the winter from freezing to death. Heat waves are sensational and keep driving the narrative that we must continue to reduce emissions. But the winter heating and deaths related to cold exposure are generally a bigger problem in most countries.
All right, we have a number of hands up. Ryan, Daryl, then Leonard is our order.
Well, I think Madi preempted my first question, which would have been what his opinions or thoughts were on President Wanderland's remarks this morning, calling on EU nations to reduce their consumption by 15% progressively to get things situated for the coming winter. I personally feel like North American capacity to export or increase exports of LNG to Europe might be able to offset this supply deficit if we can make it through the current winter. I wondered what your thoughts or opinions were on increasing investments in LNG facilities here in the US to deliver cargoes to Europe and supply them with the energy they need to keep their economies going.
I mean, certainly terrific idea, but building an LNG facility takes 3 years in optimal conditions. That's number one. Number two, I think there's also some concern in the US about US, energy prices. I think we are very spoiled in the US, and natural gas prices are at $7, roughly $7 today. LNG, there are domestic US interests that don't want to export that much natural gas if that means higher prices for them. There's very powerful interest groups that use natural gas. For example, most petrochemicals, plastics, fertilizers utilize natural gas in some capacity. So if I was an owner of a fertilizer manufacturing facility, right? I would rather the German fertilizer manufacturers all go bankrupt, and so you buy fertilizer from me instead of me exporting natural gas to Europe. And so this, again, is a very cynical view of the world, but as natural gas prices rise in the US, those concerns, will continue to be heard. And there are many export facilities, and the reality is the majority of them have not received a federal permit for construction. And you might want to wonder why that is. And again, there are interest groups that would rather have natural gas, at $3. I mean, $3 per million BTUs here, as opposed to going higher and towards European levels. So I think that's one consideration I take into account.
I'm thinking specifically Sempra Energy out of California and Conoco signed a deal to increase LNG production. I think they're adding a whole new liquefaction train on a facility that's already existing, which admittedly will take a couple of years. But I read a news article within the last week that mentioned Pemex down in Mexico had signed a joint venture agreement and already inked a deal to build an entirely new liquefaction facility, and all of the equipment had already been procured. It was just a matter of getting it set up and online. And if I'm not mistaken, that was going to be coming on Q3 of 2022. So I'm a little more optimistic about our ability to increase natural gas exports here. But I totally agree with you on the coming winter and the problems that presents.
Certainly, Ryan. Again, U.S. export capacity will increase over time. But don't forget that the global economy and energy fuels goes up every single year. The only exception was 2020 due to COVID lockdowns. So all the talk about transitioning of fossil fuels towards some future, renewable future, the data shows that the demand for LNG, for crude oil, for every source of energy is going up every year. And LNG cargoes heading to Europe are competing against LNG cargoes heading to Asia and other parts.
Yeah,
and other parts of the world. So certainly there'll be more capacity, but I'm also pretty certain that a year, 2 years from now, the global economy is going to be bigger and is going to be demanding more energy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Daryl, friend of the space and one of our favorite tank veterans here, please ask your question to Lucas.
Okay, I got a couple of things I want to ask about. First of all, when you talk about fossil fuels being left on during the periods where renewables are in use, they're not actually running at full capacity. Am I correct? Or I know they have to run but it would not be at full capacity per se. Correct?
That's my understanding, Daryl. And again, it depends on the type of plant. Power plants do need to run in some reduced capacity. Natural gas plants can actually be turned down almost entirely, from what I understand.
Okay. And then the other thing, how much of the processes that use natural gas are not necessarily market friendly? As far as I know, in a lot of countries in Europe, they're protected industries. And so some of that natural gas that's being used, say, for fertilizers or whatever, how many of those plants are not necessarily efficient, but are just protected due to protectionism policies
I can
within the
answer that,
EU.
Daryl. I can answer that. The chemical and plastics industry in Europe is one of the most competitive we have. It is completely in the line of fire. There is no protection for them at all.
Okay, all right. I know there are certain industries that are, and that was the
Absolutely. You're right.
So
You're right. They absolutely are, but they have a completely different field of fire than other industries, which have always been supported or sanctioned and protected.
okay, and then now we get to personal use. I mean, personal production. How is that? Is that regulated or non-regulated within, say, Germany, where personal, like, what I'm gonna say, the solar cells on homes? How much of that is in use? Because I mean, these things all have the ability to increase production and lower the offset, produce some kind of offsets where it's not in use all the time as far as the grid.
So Daryl, I think there's a couple sort of sub points on that. Just going back to the previous question regarding industries that are sort of exposed to the market. Fertilizer are very exposed to market forces, but also there are others that have strategic political significance, like Volkswagen, right? So I called it nationalization, and Axel corrected me that it's probably not going to be nationalization, it's going to be state loan guarantees of some sort.
Yes.
Yeah, so what I would say is there are large manufacturing facilities of cars in Germany. They require energy. With energy prices where they are, those facilities are not going to be globally competitive. And so the money to plug the hole is going to come from the government in some form, be it nationalization or endless subsidies. And so I think that these firms are going to have a very hard time surviving on their own. I think, would that be a correct way of framing it, Axel? So that's how I would frame the debate. With
Axel
respect,
is still on mute. I don't think you realized it.
Okay, and then how much of the natural gas is being used by fleets? I know that gasoline is expensive, and I know LNG or LNG is used in some fleets.
I don't think
At
that's
least
used primarily as a transportation fuel in Europe. I could be wrong, Daryl, but if I'm not mistaken, the primary consumers are industrial for things like making fertilizer and plastics.
Okay,
Germany.
So
because I know
industrial
here,
as well as home heating. The majority of
Yeah.
homes, at least in Poland, have some form of natural gas heating.
what about PPG? Using propane, how much of that is in use as an alternate to natural gas?
Just consider those two synonymous in this discussion.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so that's I just want to know some of the particulars on the outskirts of just the base of industrial use, because that was we're looking industrial, but there are other facets to that, and I was just wondering about those things there. Thanks.
The big challenge is the costs are going up, and someone's gonna pay for it one way or another. So in Europe, I was just in Poland 2 months ago. A loaf of bread now costs the equivalent of $2.50, which is a completely insane price for a Polish consumer to pay that much for bread. The old bread is still a big part of the cuisine in many forms, and not just in Poland, as you can imagine. So food prices and energy prices, which are, my grandfather's. He's in retirement. He gets a small pension. He's looking at his home heating bill. He's heating less, and he's paying. He basically was able to cut his heating quite substantially, and he pays 80% more this year than he paid last year, and he's being told to expect a doubling of prices next year. So for a lot of people, that's going to be, that is one of the big shocks. And then the question is, how do you pay for it? The government in a way can make the utility companies eat the difference, or in some way not let them raise rates in some way, but that just then puts the problem back on the government's shoulders. So there's probably going to be a variety of solutions here, and different outcomes. With respect to solar, Daryl, I think you asked earlier, every country is a little bit different. There's variety of feed-in government of changing those agreements retroactively. I can tell you in Poland, there was one feed-in tariff established and substantial subsidies for installing solar. A lot of people rushed out to install that. And so the feed-in tariff was, let's say, X, which would be the retail price of electricity. Of generating electricity and the price of distributing electricity. And so if you give people a credit for supplying the grid with electricity at the retail price of electricity, you're actually shortchanging the utility company, right? Because you're not including the cost of the grid. So they went back and they changed it. Rate which electricity, the rate at which you're supplying, the price at which you're supplying electricity to the grid is now much lower, much closer to the wholesale price of electricity, which is closer to half of the retail price, right? So a lot of people are very unhappy about that, right? Because they installed solar on one assumption, and that was exact coming. Solar again is unlikely to solve Europe's energy problem anytime soon.
One last thing. What about the wood pellets? I know we ship a lot of wood pellets to Europe. What's that market looking like right now?
I have no insight into the wood pellet market.
If I may interject, just for a second. My parents are from Poland. They heat with pellets. The price has gone up by roughly 70%.
That's right. I mean, the price of all sort of energy sources has gone up. The Polish government, when I was there, is groping with the fact that there may be a shortage of coal for the coal utilities that need it, and they're their heads. And quite a few consumers in Poland are still heating their homes with coal, even though it's very environmentally unfriendly. Coal is one of the cheapest sources, and if you have a coal burning, heating system, you're used to buying coal. And again, the price has dramatically. Coal price up. International wholesale prices are up like 11x over the last 18 months. Now, every regional market is different, but that gives you a sense of the trajectory. So there's stimulus programs now in Poland for consumers buying coal as well. Again, it's coming from the government budget in some way. But all prices for all electricity are going up. And whether you're generating electricity from wood pellets or you're generating heat, either way, that's a concern.
I think we have a pipeline question from Vuk, and then we have one from Leonard, and then I would really like to get back to my leading indicators because you're touching upon this all the time, but I think it's an important feature for us. But Vuk, please, pipelines.
Thank you. So I may be wrong about this. I've run across this analysis that this is going to be long to explain. Say most of Russians' oil fields or gas fields, roughly the same thing, really, are in permafrost areas. And the tricky thing is that you need to have a certain pressure in the pipes to keep the fields flowing. And the idea is if there's not enough demand down the line, you have to shut it down, and you face a situation where you cannot simply turn the gas back on, so to speak. And my question would be, is this actually a real thing? And say we'll be facing a decrease in global gas production in the near years. So the current situation would be a situation we'll be confronting in the, say, next 2, 3, 5, whatever years. And the second is, how would that impact the situation in general? Thank you.
Well, Vuk, thank you for the question. As I am not an expert in operating natural gas plants in the Russian permafrost, I'm going to politely pass this question on to someone who may be able to answer it better. But I really don't have.
Well, we have, Vuk, I think we have someone with Ryan who can actually talk about pipelines from an oil perspective, but that's a different thing. I think we have a question, Vuk, if we can put a pin into this, and Ryan and I come back to that question in a little while. But stay with us. Leonard, you had a question for Lukasz.
Yes, I did. And thank you, Axel. And thank you also, Tomasz, for sharing with us the depth of your expertise here. Now, I just have a couple of quick questions for you. And firstly, just so you know, I'm calling out of Western Canada. I'm just a country lawyer based in Alberta. But we have a deputy premier here who coincidentally, a former deputy premier, which is deputy prime minister, of course, who has precisely the same name as yourself. So I'm just wondering if you have any relatives in this neck of the woods.
Thank you for that comic relief question, Leonard. My last name, I'm sorry, are you referring to my first name or my last name? My last name is actually...
Oh, I'm sorry. His name is Thomas Lukasz, which I saw as your name.
Oh, okay. Well, Łukasz is the Polish version for Lucas, and it's one of the most common names in Poland. I was in a class, in my high school class in Poland. We had 32 kids, and 5 of them were named Lucas. Okay, my last name is incredibly rare, but there are a couple Canadians with that last name, and I believe there's a Tomicki Avenue somewhere. You can look at this up. There's some Tomicki construction company or kind of home renovation. There's a couple in the U.S.
Okay.
Rare last name, at least.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, you were just breaking up a touch there at the end, but the question is this: now, the Thomas that I have dealt with in this part of the world, he's also very familiar and very active in the energy sector. Obviously, you're probably aware of the degree to which energy matters, oil, gas, and all of the refining aspects are critical issues in the Alberta economy. But specifically, now I just have a question for you in terms of how you assemble the data that you base your conclusions on, because in his case, and he was born and raised in Poland as well, and then educated in Canada, but he's seems to have a much more bullish outlook in terms of the Ukraine's prospects in this entire escapade, and he seems to be you might even say hyperactive in the efforts and the pro-Ukraine activities in this part of the world, and specifically with reference to your assessments on energy, it just listening to him and listening to you, and of course I'm not an energy expert, I'm just a country lawyer here, but it seems that he's far less pessimistic in terms of his projections and in terms and how this will impact the future and the unfolding of the Ukraine situation. So I'm just wondering how much of your calculations, which seem to be based heavily on a sort of a spreadsheet economic analysis, which is fine and which everybody understands the importance of that, but also I would just get a sense that you seem to be reflecting a goodly portion of the current presiding sentiment of the German administration and their chancery. I'm just wondering how you balance your conclusions that this sort of almost foreboding, I might say, with respect to how Russia may somehow find its objectives in this thing. How you balance that off with the kind of very visceral attitude that seems to be coming out of Great Britain to start with, and of course Canada, Australia, and the United States now, sometimes referred to as the Anglosphere, but there seems to be a very deeply rooted sentiment here that is marshaling directly against all of Putin's objectives. And we understand his game plan is very short term. It's obviously he's playing a short game here. And he was hoping to have Germany over the barrel, which clearly he does. And based upon your assessments with regard to Volkswagen and all the major players, seems to do so. But there's a longer game here as well. And has been addressed throughout the Anglosphere over the last 100 years, you might say, almost. And it just seems to me that I don't see much reflection in your analysis of the beyond the economics, just to the sheer political, if you will, and or ideological commitment and humanitarian commitments out of the Anglosphere that are not really amenable to some of the less committed aspects and some of the wobbling we've seen coming out of Germany. And I'll just conclude by saying that you're probably aware the gas reserves alone in Alberta would be enough to light up Europe probably for 100 years. And there's already efforts underway with respect to the Energy East project and construction of LNG terminals on the east coast of Canada. And we've had mothballed, unfortunately, there were 3 major LNG projects mothballed on the west coast of Canada, the Pacific coast. And I'm sure you're aware in Austin that there's American plans right now in Houston to regenerate and revive LNG. So I'm just wondering how you draw the line between sort of the spreadsheet economic analysis and the, I would say, the more overriding fundamental political, cultural, and if not outright millennial considerations for the future of the planet. And I mean, by that I mean the political future, and by that I mean the strong movement against tyranny in any of our spheres. I just wonder how you balance that, or if you do balance that in your spreadsheet equations. So thank you for that, sir.
Thank you for all your questions, Leonard. To address, yes, I think there's enormous energy resources there, but there has to be a political will to develop them, and there has to be political certainty for companies to want to invest to develop those resources, because as you mentioned, they're extremely long-lived assets. So if I'm a company, I'm going to invest, I have to have some degree of certainty that building out the processing facilities, the pipelines, those will be around for 10, 20, 30 years. The government of Canada is not particularly friendly right now to fossil fuels, and in general, Western governments are acting as if they are trying to get off fossil fuels as soon as possible. So if I'm an executive at a oil and gas company, I would simply be shoveling back cash to shareholders through dividends and buybacks and not investing, because I think it's insane to invest in new capacity in the current environment. So that's number one. And I would point you to oil battle at the Formula One race in Canada at the Grand Prix. I think those are very well reflective of well-to-do Germans who have the money to indulge in sort of environmental policies. So that's the attitude I think a lot of people still have about Canadian oil sands. With respect to the military situation in Ukraine, I am not a military expert by no means. I certainly don't. I hope I didn't present myself as a military expert. I'm looking at this from the perspective of an outsider. And initially, some people thought that Russia would take Kiev in 3 or 4 days. Clearly, that's not happened. And I think that was too optimistic. And now, from, again, not getting into the weeds of one missile or versus, I hear now saying that in the next 6 to 12 months, Ukraine will effectively kick Russia out of all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. And I'm questioning if that will really happen. So that's my only point, and that's as deep as my analysis goes. I don't get into one missile system versus another.
Thank you for that, sir.
The U.S. To doing a lot in terms of, the U.S. committing to help the situation. The U.S. is helping, but it is helping, I think, in a tentative way, right? I believe the numbers I've seen are between 3 to 3.5 million Ukrainian refugees in Poland. The U.S. is not committing to take massive amounts of refugees, in the millions. We're doing several tens of thousands, 100,000. Those are the numbers that I'm hearing. And there are some that are, arriving in Texas. There are groups I'm a member of. But we're not talking about millions. Again, being quite cold and calculating as an investor, none of this should be construed as pessimism. The U.S. is a relative winner in this horrible world, unfortunately. The worst the better the U.S. The political situation is not great. The debt is not great. There's all sorts of issues. But the U.S. looks a hell of a lot better than parts of Europe. And Europe, by the way, I think will muddle through this in some way or fashion. Europe has survived horrific events and they'll get through this as well. But this just makes the U.S. look even better. And I would lastly say that the U.S. very often doesn't have the high ground in terms of the moral position. I just watched a documentary about Jewish refugees that went to Shanghai during World War II. And one of the reasons they ended up going to Shanghai is because the U.S. was not willing to take them. And so the U.S. certainly was not fully committed to helping Europe during World War II. I mean, they were at some point, but it was always reactive, and I think that's likely to be the same case here. I hope I answered all your questions, Leonard.
Well, you certainly hit all of them, and I thank you for that. And you've raised a considerable amount of food for thought here. So I think we'll all be taking away many hours of follow-up thinking as to what you've raised here. So thank you.
Lucas, while I have you for a little longer, can I ask a little bit about your views on U.S. energy production, which I think absolutely plays into this, as well as both the inflation discussions going on, because a lot of it's energy driven, flowing through the system, and the ability for the U.S. to replace the currently tanking Russian production supply.
Certainly, although I would say, I don't have reliable numbers on the Russian production supply, but for those of you who are not familiar, there is something called the Latvian blend of crude oil, which you may be surprised at the name, since Latvia doesn't produce any crude oil. And what the Latvian blend is simply Russian crude blended with other crudes. Latvian blend. One way is making its way onto global markets, and I think markets are fungible and tradable, and so if one country doesn't want Russian crude, some other country will take it, and I think that's what you're seeing. And the obvious suspects are China and India. So I'm not sure that there's going to be that dramatic of a decrease in the near term. There may be some production declines over the longer term as sanctions make it more difficult to produce and raise output or maintain output from declining oil fields without external technology.
Yeah,
but that's a longer term question.
Yeah, I can kick this to Madi. We've been running numbers together basically since we started talking after this current war broke out. They were predicted to be around 3 to 5% declines. Ryan also has these numbers before the war broke out. Now they're looking at least 10% declines. Those numbers might be as high as 17 to 22% declines in production year over year. Very hard to get accurate information out of Russia. Absolutely has to do with pretty much all of their foreign partners pulling out, because that's all of their both skilled industrial workers and their skilled engineers pulling out, because even the people that are local from Russia, from Russian universities, which are good at math and things, tend to go get jobs at these places where they pay better. So we're looking at good numbers. Madi, what's our current estimate? Or Ryan, you guys have that. What's our current estimate on Russian production declines?
Their original projection was 3 or 5%, and it turned out to be 10, and that's when they kind of clammed up. There have been some internal documents that made it into the news where somebody in the Russian economy chain of command was forecasting about a 17% decline in production by year end, and I was spitballing that if they're forecasting 17, it'll probably be 25. But it's going to get ugly.
Madi, you look at some Russian local regional papers. What are you thinking?
Yeah, 17% is probably a good conservative estimate. Conservative being on the side of positivity for the Russians. It's probably going to be a lot more. But this number combines both the civilian and military sector. We're currently seeing that the Russian economy is getting heavily militarized. So their civilian sector is probably going to be pretty much dead in many of the industries by the end of this year. So we also financing framework, but we also looked at energy consumption in the energy grid within Russia. And it kind of supports this narrative where we've seen those regions that don't have any military facilities are actually experiencing a significant decrease in their energy consumption, whereas those regions that do contain factories from the military-industrial complex, they have a somewhat of a moderate increase in energy consumption.
So that's what we're thinking, 17-ish% or worse for Russian production declines by year end.
Here's another factor to consider in all of that. Russia isn't accustomed to storing their commodities they produce, so they don't have massive ability to store either produced crude like we have in the US with the salt domes and the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, nor do they have the ability to store large volumes of gas. If they're not delivering this gas into Europe and they don't have pipeline infrastructure or liquefaction facilities to put that on a boat and send it somewhere else, they're going to have to flare that gas, or they're going to have to shut in the wells. And when you shut in the wells, you run the risk of damaging the well bore. And when you bring it back online, it may or may not do what it did when you shut it in. They can flare gas, but where can they park the crude?
If I may, that's kind of my question, because that's exactly what happened in the early 90s, if I recall. That's the problem they faced, and they basically froze their production, which didn't come online until, like, I guess 20 years later, which was with hefty support from the Western knowledge by...
it didn't come online until Halliburton brought them back online.
Basically, yeah. And so if that's not on the table, then we're talking about a decrease that's not just a dip, that's permanent.
Yeah, I think that kind of scenario brings us to the worse than 17%, more problematic scenarios for Russian production. I won't exactly cry for the results for their economy, but it does matter for the global economy that everyone has energy. Hence why I asked Lucas where he's viewing on domestic and North American energy and energy investment production opportunities in general, because that's the kind of thing I know he is looking at.
Yeah, so I mean, I think anyone can look at this data, which is U.S. crude production is rising, perhaps not as quickly as we'd like it to be rising, but it's rising, and this is public data. Crude output in the Permian Basin is at all record. Crude is, but it is increasing. And there are shortages of everything still, though I'm sure over time those shortages of everything being pipe, drilling equipment, roughnecks, workers, etc. But those are things that can be alleviated over time. Having said that, global demand is also going to rise probably this year as well, as it has every year, except again 2020. So. We need more crude. We need it now, and I think we need a political consensus that have to for
Lucas
in the next 5 years.
Lucas, you broke up at we need a political consensus, and then we couldn't hear you, sir.
Sorry, I was going to say we need a political consensus that we need more investment, because the political climate, not just in the U.S., is making that investment very difficult.
I definitely say regularly on this space that I am in favor of every kind of energy, renewable, nuclear, drilling, wells, whatever. Bring it all online. I'm okay with pretty much all energy that doesn't support genocide. That's my only caveat. So I think at least we're agreed. We have a couple more hands up. David, welcome back up to the space. Then Madi again.
Sorry, I do apologise. I was trying to find my mic. So if it helps, I could probably give you some insights to what it's like on the ground in the UK with regards to some of this stuff. So it would just give you a little bit of information. So the buy-in tariff, if someone's solar in the UK is 9 pence. As it stands at the moment, that's per kilowatt hour. As it stands, if you're buying in electricity, it's 32 pence per kilowatt hour. I think, what's that, 43 cents or something like that. There's a thought that the price per kilowatt hour of electricity might go to 45 pence later in the year per kilowatt hour, right? So as it stands within the UK, if anyone who's selling back to the grid, that's just madness. And your best option would be to get yourself a battery and put your solar onto a battery and just store it. And you would be paying back pretty quickly. Where wood is concerned, so wood pellets aren't a big thing over here, but wood is. In the UK, we currently have an environmental tragedy, which is ash dieback, where they think that 85% or 80% of ash trees are just going to die. It's a bit like Dutch elm disease, and that's in the next 5 to 10 years. So there's going to be a lot of hardwood available. Obviously, the tragedy is that we're gonna lose an awful lot of forests. As it stands, I've been looking at it. It makes sense to remove your gas and just change what you've got and put in a wood burner. There's some costs there as well, because the people who put in wood burners are convinced the government that this has to be coded, and the people who can put them in now charge a premium, so they might charge you about £1,500 to put something in that would take them about 2 hours, because they've managed to develop themselves a bit of a monopoly. I turned off gas as a result in this in my house, as a result of to be as a statement against for Ukraine. Don't ask me about the price of gas, but I think it's going to be per therm. It's going to be pretty dreadful. And this winter, there were some cases of, and this is something I used to see as a kid, right, where you used to see people on around the coal mines who would be looking on the pits, trying to find coal. And there were some cases this year of people going to old coal mountains, trying to find coal and take it. Technically, you're not supposed to be using it because we've got the Clean Air Act, but where keeping your houses warm in this country, it's going to be an absolute nightmare if you have an old house. And in the UK, our houses leak like nobody's business. It's going to be grim times.
Thank you for that, David. You know, I actually grew up in Cheshire, in a little town called Warrington. So
yes, good old Warrington. So you'll have noticed it. So look, right, we forget how things have changed. As a kid, I used to wake up in the winter. Every winter, there would be ice on the inside of the window, right? So but times have changed, and our houses really do leak. But the point where you've got someone who's going over an old slag heap, as it's called, trying to find usable coal, then there's a bit of a problem, right?
Correct, absolutely. I'd address one other matter kind of related to what you were mentioning. Home heat from furnaces that are that are coal powered is still an ongoing issue, and as you mentioned, those are extremely polluting. So if you go to Krakow in the winter, you'll notice substantial smog and air pollution. You can also see there are these maps, particular region, and in particular southern Poland, is often one of the most polluted parts of Europe, and so that's unfortunately a very big concern. You know, and in that context, I really see the German decisions to move away from nuclear energy, you know, so difficult to.
Yeah, for anyone who sees it must think it's madness, right?
Correct, and you know, I understand there are risks to nuclear, and I do appreciate the point, but there are substantial risks and deaths due to you know, air pollution. You know, I am concerned about the climate. I would simply say that I'm concerned about the environment. I do say some people have accused me of denying climate change, and that's not true. I'm simply much more concerned about environmental air pollution rather than rising temperature, probably.
Absolutely right. I couldn't agree more, Lukasz, because the key to solving this is next-gen nuclear power and smaller size nuclear power plants, widely distributed. That's exactly the point.
And the problem will be the time to get them developed.
No. It's actually not. That's not true anymore. We have already at least 3 different, say, small-scale nuclear power systems which have already left the testing stage. This is significantly further advanced than the general public believes, because currently both media and governments are not pushing it. In the 1970s, Germany was amongst the top 2 nations worldwide developing nuclear power plants. And then the KGB intervened. But let's leave it aside and let's go to Marty.
All right, we are running. Lucas, how much longer do we have you for here?
For another 22 minutes.
All right. Well, let's go to Marty, and then we'll take another question, and we'll let you wrap it up as you wish.
That's a really quick question, because I know Axel wants to discuss leading indicators. So back in March, Halliburton, Schlumberger, Baker Hughes suspended their operations in Russia. So what are the implications for the Russians? Will they be able to service their rigs and pipelines themselves? And if not, do you expect that it's going to disrupt any supplies going from Russia into Europe because of that?
I mean, I think certainly in the short term it will, and it may people are not hopeless. So they're going to be able to replace some Western expertise with their own people. And I think as Finance mentioned, you know, a lot of the highly trained Russian engineers that were working for Halliburton may now simply work for a Russian company of some sort. So I think over time, I'm so pessimistic on Russia's
2 things, Lucas.
technical abilities.
I think that we could.
Yeah, Lucas, we're losing you 1, and 2, you misunderstood me. I don't think they're going to go work for a Russian company, because Russian companies do things like pay engineers $400 a week, and foreign companies pay them, you know, what you'd expect an electrical or geothermal or, you know, any kind of major engineer
I certainly
to be
get
paid.
that, but now that there's no more from the, so, you know, $800 a month. Let's not forget Russia, you know, built you know, rockets and things that went into space before NASA did. So I'm simply saying, with time, there is technical expertise and there are smart people in Russia. So I'm not so down on the long-term capabilities of fixing this in Russia.
I'm very much down on this, Lukasz. This is where I beg to differ, and for a long say, backstory, which I could provide you with, but we don't have the time for it today, so I shall hope that you come back, because Marty and I and others went through this in quite some detail. The lack of innovation capacity of a totalitarian regime such as Russia, and its concentration on essentially poaching technologies and trying to exploit them rather than ever facing competition to innovate, has led the best of Russians, because the distribution of intelligence is pretty much the same. It's Gaussian everywhere. The problem is, how do you elevate intelligence? And that is culture. And that culture is lacking. The culture won't change. The rockets example you just brought forward, by the way, these were rocket scientists who came from different countries, 3 in particular, and they were taken away, just like rocket scientists from Germany went also to the United States and from Austria, as well as from, by the way, what became later on the Czech Republic. It's a different life there. And what our friends have indicated, and Ryan can talk about pipelines all the time, and pipelines I can agree on the other matter, meaning as to Halliburton and Schlumberger. Schlumberger has employed in Russia a significant amount of local personnel. Very few of them highly educated and, shall we say, leading engineers. Very few people actually of good scientific qualification amongst them who they would take on board. They have evacuated hundreds of their staff because Schlumberger is not stupid and they are a very decent employer. And not only their French side, but also especially the Canadians, who have been, very much at the forefront of the hydrocarbon extraction capacity services our friends have brought there. But the key thing is, it is predominantly people from Western countries who've been doing the hard graft. And I'll give you an anecdote from a facility operated, serviced, and to a large extent built by 3 German companies and 1 French company together, where an Italian supplier participated in the project financing. And they went and built it in between Omsk and its surroundings. And it was an important project. And at the moment in time, when the project was opened to be shown to media and have Putin arrive personally there, all the foreign engineers and all the foreign operators were asked to take a vacation for 3 days so that they would not show up in media, because they wanted to make sure that they could show, the quality of Russian engineering and having happy Russians and happy Siberian locals having good jobs and doing a great job and having built a great facility. This is not unusual. Marty can tell you more stories about it. This is exactly what they do. The Potemkin village has not changed as a concept because the emptiness of culture does not produce innovation. They are looking at a very bleak future.